Hiya folks, Carl James here from Electric Media Madness, joining me for another Strange Tales. And in today's episode, I wanted to talk about Bond, James Bond. I wanted to specifically talk about the film Diamonds Are Forever from 1971. Now, for many, many years of my life, I have been interested in the subject of NASA, and specifically the Apollo missions to the moon, and this notion that something about the missions to the moon has been covered up. Possibly all of it. I'm not going to really get into that subject today. That's a subject for a very, very, very long video. I'm sure there will be people who will drop comments in about the subject, but that's for them, not for this video. A number of alternative knowledge researchers have brought up Diamonds Are Forever because they believe that the film in some way alludes to this notion of an Apollo cover-up. Specifically one scene in the film. I'm going to go to an article from a number of years back now. It's from the 007 magazine. It's entitled Diamonds Are Forever Moon Buggy. And it says, while investigating multi-millionaire recluse Willard White's Tectonic Space Center outside Las Vegas in the Nevada desert, his cover is blown. James Bond, Sean Connery, finds it necessary to make a hasty exit. Finding himself in an artificial moonscape complete with trainee astronauts, Bond dashes for a nearby moon buggy vehicle and crashes out of the center and into one of the 007's film's most famous chase scenes. And it is a very, very unusual film. It's very odd. It doesn't sit particularly well in the context of the story. There are some connections, which I'm going to get to in a moment. It really is bizarre, and people have talked about this notion. I have talked extensively about the theory that Stanley Kubrick may have been, if not involved with, that he certainly knew something about things that were going on in NASA, cover-ups in NASA to do with Apollo. And there's a lot more to this. Whenever I hear people talk about Diamonds Are Forever in this scene, they'll say, oh, it's unusual. Yes, it is very, very unusual. But is there something more concrete there that connects all of the NASA stuff into the film? There is quite a bit with James Bond, and specifically with this film. So in order to do that, in order to lay out some of these ideas, I'm going to go through some kind of like a 6 degrees of separation, a game of connecting the dots here to try and sort of paint a larger picture. And it might seem like a bit of a digression on this, but it's worth noting that there is a larger esoteric significance to James Bond, specifically Bond's creator, Ian Fleming, who has had documented connections with British intelligence community, for example. He was a high-level British naval PSYOPs officer. He actually helped Bill Donovan to set up the OSS, which was a precursor to the CIA. Fleming was also believed to be involved with the Enigma coding machine, Operation Mincemeat, and Assault Unit 30, which is a covert operations team. His name often crops up in association with this term called the Baker Street Irregulars, which was, the name was inspired by Sherlock Holmes' story. And this is a group of people who were involved in creative, writing, film, television, all that sort of thing. Roald Dahl, I believe, was one of them. One of the people involved with it, Noel Coward. I've heard rumours that Christopher Lee was involved with the Baker Street Irregulars as well. In terms of what we, in alternative knowledge research circles, called agenda players, it's salient that Fleming mentions the Rothschild family in some of the early James Bond novels, most notably on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And seeing as we're talking about British intelligence services, it's worth looking back to the origins of that organisation, historical connections with the occult via alchemy and the such. The occult appears to have been prevalent in agencies like NASA. We'll come into that again in a moment. James Bond's roots lie with this chap called John Dee. He was a 16th century mathematician. He was an astronomer, he was an alchemist, he was a navigator, he was an imperialist, and he was a devoted consort of Queen Elizabeth I. And he was a student of philosophy, divination, the occult, associated Freemason as well. He was instrumental in what was then the version of what we would now call MI5. And his code name was 007. And John Dee was Ian Fleming's inspiration for James Bond. So we've got that little bit of context out of the way first. Let's go back to Diamonds Are Forever now. Let's begin with the recluse's business tycoon, Howard Hughes, and former US President Richard Nixon. They were known to have worked together through wealthy associates and personal confidants, them sorts of things. And some of those were actually involved in the Bay of Pigs incident and Watergate incident as well, for that matter. Howard Hughes supported Nixon's early political career, both expressively and financially. And according to the noted alternative knowledge researcher Mae Russell, a substantial part of the subsequent Hughes-Nixon relationship was based on mafia-styled money, and specifically laundering the money through Las Vegas, Miami and connections between the Hughes Aircraft Company and the CIA. That was Brussels' claims. So I just want to refer for a moment to this article from Playboy magazine in September 1976, and the investigative reporters Larry Dubois and Lawrence Gonzalez, and they uncovered many backroom deals between Howard Hughes, the CIA, Richard Nixon, and Robert Mayhew, who worked for the FBI, the CIA, and as chief executive of Nevada operations for Hughes. Mayhew corroborated the Playboy account during an episode of 60 Minutes, which aired on February 28th, 2005. And during the presidency, which was between January 1969 August 1974, Richard Nixon presided over the key years of NASA's Apollo program. So that's an interesting thing there for a start. So 1968, Howard Hughes' aircraft company had become one of the top defence contractors and was actually the CIA's #1 industrial contractor. And between June 1966 and I think it was January 1968, NASA sent several robotic probes to the moon. Probes were actually sent to the surface of the moon, allegedly, to photograph ready for the forthcoming Apollo missions. And the program was implemented by NASA's JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, at the time. And these surveyor missions consisted of unmanned probes that were designed and built by Hughes Aircraft Company. Bringing it back to Diamonds Are Forever, take note of the real life connections here. You have Nixon, Hughes, the Mafia, the CIA, and then the fictional plot of Diamonds Are Forever, which revolves around mafia orchestrated diamond smuggling in Las Vegas. As a little side note here, it's worth mentioning as well, it may not be of any significance to anybody, but I do find it interesting that in my research I've quite often come across connections between the film industry and specifically science fiction, actually, things like Battlestar Galactica, Hangar 18, the Mormon Church, and the CIA as well. And it is interesting that Hughes insisted on employing Mormons as his bodyguards. That's a little side note there. Personal staff as well as bodyguards. So let's go now to the autobiography of Cubby Broccoli, who was responsible for overseeing the James Bond production at that time, the films. And there's his book, his autobiography, which was called When the Snow Melts. And in it, Broccoli described his lifelong friendship with Howard Hughes and how intricately involved Hughes was in making Diamonds Are Forever. It was shot in Las Vegas. Hughes was heard to remark at the time, "Tell Cubby he can shoot anywhere, anytime, in any of the hotels that I own." And this was documented in When the Snow Melts, the autobiography of Cubby Broccoli. Hughes is also portrayed in the film, quasi-portrayed in the film, in the form of the reclusive tycoon Willard White. And White owns the Nevada desert facility Tectronic Space Labs, where Bond discovers the fake moon set that I talked about at the beginning of this video. So let's jump now to the person who was responsible for designing the film. And this was Ken Adam. And Adam famously designed the war room in Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove. Now, Ken Adam was a very close friend of Stanley Kubrick, and he was the overall production designer on Dr. Strangelove and Barry Lyndon. And Kubrick offered Adam the same role on 2001: A Space Odyssey. And as I mentioned before, there are connections to the subject of NASA and Apollo and that to Stanley Kubrick. NASA was heavily involved with the production of 2001: A Space Odyssey, as I've documented in much of my research. To quite a large degree they were involved. Kubrick offered Ken Adam the same role of head production designer on 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he declined. Now, I want to read from this article from 2008. It's an article from the Telegraph called Ken Adam, the Man Who Drew the Cold War. And in it, Ken Adam is quoted as saying, "I found out that he," meaning Kubrick, had been working with experts from NASA for a year on space exploration and all that sort of thing. And the moment I saw that, I thought, not for me, because I could only function properly with this very powerful computer-like brain of Stanley by knowing as much visually about the subject matter as he did, because then I could justify departing from the visual reality that he knows." And that's interesting because it based on the timeline, it appears that Ken Adam passed up the opportunity to work on 2001: A Space Odyssey in favour of working on the James Bond films, specifically, albeit a couple of years later, Diamonds Are Forever. So if that statement is true, it appears that he turned down a film influenced by and with connections to NASA, only to accept another film a couple of years later with influenced by and with NASA connections. And now, in fairness, the connections with Diamonds Are Forever, they're far less obvious, But nevertheless, they do exist. We talked about Howard Hughes and Howard Hughes aircraft production, connections to the Surveyor probes, that sort of thing, connections to the CIA. So there are connections there, albeit a little bit less obvious than 2001: A Space Odyssey, but they are there. Furthermore, Adam followed up Diamonds Are Forever with the 1979 film Moonraker. And the plot of Moonraker involves, amongst other things, the cover-up of missing American spacecrafts. In these cases, they were the Moonraker space shuttles and a secret space program, which directly ties into this idea that NASA was involved in covering up something up with the Apollo missions. You know, if you go for that idea, which I do. So we have these things going on in the film. Also, it's worth noting that Bond is even seen jumping out of a plane flown by Apollo Airlines in Moonraker. So there we are. I mean, lots of little things here, lots of little sort of interconnected things, 6 degrees of separation as I call them. Not a huge amount of information about this film, but I thought it was worth putting this information out there. And I do wonder sometimes about Ken Adams' reasoning, his decision, why he decided to reject Kubrick's film that was heavily associated with NASA to go off and involve himself with these other things which did have NASA connections, albeit less obvious, like I say, than 2001. I find it a little bit strange. Maybe Ken Adams knew more than he was letting on, specifically where Stanley Kubrick is involved. That's a subject for another video, probably a very long one, but yeah. It's something I have covered in my research. I've covered it quite a bit in my books. Links are available in the description for this video if you want to check any of them out. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe if you can. I'd truly, truly appreciate it. And I will see you again very, very soon. Bye-bye for now.